What's going on, everyone? It is Thursday. We got the day off tomorrow. It's good. Hope you enjoy that. So today we are going to reread the article, Human Brain. That's it. I'm not going to discuss it. I'm not going to stop. I'm just going to read. And then after, preview a video that we'll watch about the brain. I mean, this topic can be a little dry. So anytime I find something that might be remotely entertaining, I want to bring it to you. So it's a lot of information. It's a crash course. If you've ever watched them, it's not John Green, it's his brother, but they talk really quickly on that show. So I'll have the captions, get a little reading in, and then also I'm going to preview some of the things that you'll learn in that. So if you hear it twice, you're more likely to remember it. Better than memorizing, right? So read the article, preview the video, watch the video, working class, Franken Beans, vacation. Hopefully that sounds all right to you. Hopefully you are excited for that. So I'm just going to jump into it. Remember, this is an informational text. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's to provide information. All right. Glasses on. Let's do it. The famous scientist James Watson summarized it this way. The brain boggles the mind. The human brain is truly impressive. It weighs only about 3 pounds, but controls everything a person does, has ever done, and will ever do, physically, intellectually, and emotionally. No computer even comes close to having the brain's abilities. The brain controls a person's actions, reactions, and survival functions, such as breathing. It also has the ability to think, remember, process information, and learn new things. The brain is one part of the central nervous system that controls all the body's activities. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain is protected by the skull, and the spinal cord runs through vertebrae of the back, bones that make up the spine. The spinal cord transmits messages between the brain and other parts of the body through nerve cells called neurons. If a person decides to pick up a book from the shelf, voluntary action, the brain sends that message to the arm and hand through the spinal cord. And if a person touches a hot surface and burns his or her hand, an involuntary action, the nerve cells in the hand send a pain message to the brain through the spinal cord. Constant stream of messages travels through the neurons in the spinal cord at speeds of more than 150 miles per hour. The human brain never stops working, even when a person is asleep. As well as transmitting messages through the spinal cord, neurons transmit messages from one part of the brain to the other. There are approximately 85 billion of these cells in the brain alone. Neurons send messages through tiny branch-like structures that connect to other neurons in different parts of the brain, as well as other parts of the body. The points where neurons meet and transmit information to each other are called synapses. Each neuron may be connected to as many as 10,000 other neurons, resulting in more than 100 trillion synapses in a single brain. Although a person cannot increase the amount of neurons in his or her brain, learning new things increases the number of synapse connections between them. Learning and education actually change the structure of the brain. That structure changes every time a person learns and every time that a person has a new thought or memory. The more a person learns, the more there is to think about. And the more there is to think about, the more there is to remember. As a result, the connections between neurons get stronger and the brain is able to function more effectively. It processes, thinks, analyzes, and stores information more quickly and productively than it did before these connections were made. Neurons are just cells, and everything a person knows is the result of the connection between them. Scientists have gained a wealth of knowledge about the human brain, but there is a lot they do not yet understand. The neurologist, Santiago Ramon Yaicayel, pronounced, I'm sure, horribly, for example, compares the brain to a world of unexplored continents with great stretches of unknown territory. Even so, new discoveries continually increase our knowledge of how the brain functions and how people learn. All right, one read through. Second time you've heard it. Hopefully, as we read through that one more time, you're like, oh, okay, I remember that better. I remember that better. That's the idea. So maybe read it over a third time. Hopefully, you started the Google form yesterday. you saw some of the questions, you're like, whoa, wait a second. He said voluntary, involuntary action. Again, I know where to find that. All right, so let's preview. I got to change slides, change pages here because I want to share this one page with you. It just takes so long. But it's about this guy, Phineas Gage. Let's start with this guy first. Phineas Gage, I believe, hope I don't embarrass her. Sorry, Doris. But I believe Doris mentioned this guy a couple days ago. And Phineas Gage is a story about, well, you'll hear it, but it's about a guy. And if you look at the picture there, he literally gets a spike. A spike goes right through his brain. John Green's brother, I can't remember the guy's name. He's going to tell a story about this guy. It gets slightly graphic. I mean, I don't want to spoil it, but yeah, I'm not going to spoil it, but it's all cartoon. But you can imagine like this guy. So the story is this guy, before he got the spike right through his brain, it didn't stay in there or anything. I thought it stayed in there and he had to have surgery. Apparently it went right through the brain, and like the doctors didn't even think he had been really injured that much until something happens. I don't want to spoil it. But according to anecdotal evidence, ooh, big word, right? It's just what people say, anecdotal evidence. And the thing about anecdotal evidence is it really doesn't hold up in court that well. So, but according to friends, before Phineas Gage was driven through the head with a spike, he was, I think they'll call him genial. Was that one of our words? They will call him a genial person. And that just means like super friendly, easygoing. But apparently it's all anecdotal. So it's not like hardcore evidence. It's not like, wouldn't stand in court, right? After he developed like a really mean spirit and he was kind of a grouchy guy, and he eventually will move to Europe and people lose contact with him. But it's almost like the first documentation, let's use that. It's the first documentation of how if you lose part of your brain, it may affect your personality. So that connection between the brain and the personality. Now, one thing that they're going to talk about in the video, and I'm hoping if I discuss it first now, and then you hear it again, you're not memorizing anything, but it's like, ooh, you hear it a couple times and you understand it better. This thing called phrenology. Now, if you look down there, it was only popular from about 1810 to about 1840 or so. But there were some years where scientists and doctors were saying, if you study the bumps of your skull, then you can predict somebody's personality. So if you look down there, studying bumps on your head and how they're connected to your personality. Obviously in 2022, we know that, man, that's not true. That doesn't really line up with science. But there was a time, this is the scary part to me. There was a time where people were like, oh, well, if a scientist is saying it's true, it's got to be true, right? So that worries me about 2022 is like in 40, 50 years, I'm sure some things that we just know are scientific facts, we're going to find out like, oh, we were really wrong about that. I wonder what it is, though. Obviously, we don't know what it is, but maybe it's aliens. You know, they've been watching us the whole time. How did they not know that? Right? And some people living in 2022 might think, what? Germs. Of course you need to wash your hands. How did they not know that? Well, yeah, there was a time where if you can't see it, it doesn't exist, right? And I don't know if you'll talk about it in the Civil War, Mr. Bim's class, but more people died in the Civil War from doctors than actual bullets in a sort of way. Because if there was a wound on the battlefield in the Civil War, doctors would just go from one patient to the next without cleaning instruments and anything. And so like just germs spread, bacteria. So a lot of the wounds that were suffered on the battlefield were 2022. You're like, they're going to recover and probably live full lives. But because of what science didn't know back then, they just transmitted diseases way too much. Bacteria, germs, nasty stuff. All right. Not sure if you've ever heard this. There are a lot of myths about the brain. We only use 10% of our brain. Well, They're going to debunk that myth in this crash course. Not true. Just like the left brain, right brain thing, they'll mention that again. Got a note from me right there. Yeah, they're going to mention that again. It's not true. And then they're going to talk about these three systems. Okay, one's called the old brain. We talked about that already. It's like the brain stem. It like regulates the most basic of functions. So like your breathing, things like that. Things that pretty much all living creatures have. Very basic stuff. Then you got the limbic system. Some higher level like animals have that. Reptiles, they mentioned in the video, do not. And then the cerebrum. That's what really separates us from the rest of the animals. It's the biggest part of the brain, and it handles the most intricate of our functions, such as like developing and using language. Okay. Fissures. Those are the folds of your brain. Folds of your brain. Fissures. And then another thing, the occipital lobe, which helps you, it regulates seeing, regulates sight. And that is located in the back of the brain, which kind of doesn't make sense, right? But the temporal lobe, that's responsible for how we hear, and that's just right above the ears, which makes a lot of sense. So you can imagine if somebody has damage to their temporal lobe, it might affect their hearing. So scientists are starting to understand. Remember, in the article we just read, that last paragraph is talking about how much science actually doesn't know about the brain. But they are locating, the occipital lobe back here. If you have brain damage back there, it might affect your sight. Things like that. All right, on to the video. Hopefully it will be entertaining. Phineas Gage, interesting story. See ya.